Thank you very much, John. You have done yeoman's work in pulling together this annual conference. It really does offer us a unique perspective to think outside the box, particularly from the postal world. There's so many good friends and colleagues and familiar faces in this room, but also a lot of unique perspective that normally you might not see in a normal U.S. Postal and Delivery Conference. And that's important because, as we've all talked about this morning, we'll talk about later this afternoon and tomorrow as well, the world is changing, and particularly in the postal delivery world, changing quite drastically. And we've heard this morning, and we'll continue to focus throughout today and tomorrow on the disruptive nature of that B2Me movement. The B2Me movement has changed and challenged the use of data, responses from retail, e-commerce, and delivery, and driven innovations in the supply chain. Our immediate previous panel, before we came in here for lunch, highlighted responses from national postal operators to meet this new consumer empowerment model. And so before we move after lunch to hear from the private sector perspectives, I want to take the opportunity as the U.S. regulator of our nation's postal administration to linger just a little bit longer on the governmental perspective and focus on the challenge for our U.S. Postal Service to fully adapt to the future. My B2Me, my focus today, will be to plead that policymakers and we as a nation address a basic consideration. What are the specific universal service obligations of the Postal Service? In other words, what do each of us as American citizens need from the Postal Service as a government service, and what is its cost? For we can discuss all the changes needed to transform the entire sector to focus on the B2Me movement, but without clarity on its mission, America's Postal Service will be set up for frustration and risk of failure. Here in the U.S., as Preston outlined on the last panel, our nation's postal operator has positioned itself to adapting to this changing marketplace. However, the Postal Service is trying to move forward into strong headwinds. The financials of the U.S. Postal Service are a mess. In 2015, the Postal Service had a total net loss of $5.1 billion, which is an improvement from 2014. However, this is the 9th consecutive net loss since 2007 and has increased the cumulative net deficit since then to $56.8 billion. These continuing losses have negatively impacted liquidity, requiring the Postal Service to use all of its $15 billion statutory borrowing capacity and causing total liabilities to far exceed total assets by almost $50 billion. Now, let me be clear. I am agnostic on what Congress mandates. If 218 members in the House, 60 in the Senate, and the President sign legislation, then that, under the Constitution, is the prerogative and authority of the Congress. What I am deeply concerned by, however, is that there's absolutely no cost-benefit analysis that goes on when Congress steps back into the role of the Board of Directors, despite having created one in 1970, and puts limits and restrictions and mandates on their operations. Surely there is a limit to what the Postal Service can afford and still remain self-sustaining. If instead, like other nations, we have a thoughtful back to basics, what do we require the Postal Service to do as a government entity to serve this nation? That is, what is the USO and what is its cost? We can better ensure that it can remain self-sustaining. We can also better analyze when a Congress thinks about breaking that definition open and adding or subtracting requirements, that a thoughtful analysis is undertaken as to the effect on its bottom line and ability to remain self-financing. Thus, it seems that policymakers really need to start at the beginning and decide what exactly we as a nation need and how it can be funded. But that requires the ability to engage in a thoughtful and comprehensive examination. The legislative process very seldom offers the opportunity to take such in-depth assessments, particularly with so many competing interests at stake: mailers, employees, competitors, consumers. Very often there is little unanimity among all or within each category of these groups. And in the current political environment, Unless members of Congress and senators are consistently hearing about the issue when they are back in their districts and states, it is difficult, absent a complete postal meltdown, whether Congress will act, particularly in a comprehensive manner. But the Postal Service, with its balance sheet and future projections, need clarity and certainty. I would suggest it is time. In fact, it is overdue. Is it pie in the sky to think that this back to basics can occur? No, not any more than the more limited fixes that have yet to see passage despite yeoman's efforts in congressional committees for the past half-dozen years. Maybe a focus on the fundamentals would be more fruitful. Congress wouldn't have to start at scratch. The Postal Regulatory Commission, less than 8 years ago, laid the foundation in a comprehensive report on the USO. Congress can pick it up and hit the ground running on better defining the USO. While fixing the balance sheet is critical, my call today is to not ignore the fundamentals. The vast changes we are talking about at this conference today and tomorrow can only be weathered by the U.S. Postal Service if they have clarity of mission. Despite challenges to doing so, I remain hopeful that our leaders will, at the end of the day, have the proverbial willingness to make tough decisions, the wisdom to see the world as it is rather than as we would like it to be, and the courage to compromise on behalf of the greater good. Our nation's postal system and the more than 320 million Americans who depend on it expect no less. Thank you so much.
Everybody can hear us, I think. So I'm sure Chairman Taub, you'll take the question.
Sure, happy to take any questions whatsoever. Yeah, Hamilton.
We've heard today about the importance of innovation for the Post, and perhaps that's a path away or out of some of the quandary that you presented in your presentation. What specific challenges does the regulator have in an environment of accelerating innovation, and how do you respond to that?
Thank you, Hamilton. To the extent, if people hadn't heard the question, just to restate, given the challenges and the rapid change and need to innovate within the postal and delivery sector, how does that impact, if you will, the Postal Regulatory Commission and the regulatory environment? In some ways, the Postal Regulatory Commission has a very defined role within the statute. We have final authority over the rates they set, the products they offer, adjudicate fair competition issues. We look at their service standards. We adjudicate appeals of post office closings. I would argue, to the extent that the rapidly changing environment affects the Postal Service, the cases before us and the nature of those reflect that. But we, as the regulator, are not the operator. And so to the extent that the world is a-changing and it creates these public policy challenges, those are really borne by the Postal Service itself, and where the regulator sees that are the cases before us. That being said, I do believe the expertise that we have at the Commission on the Postal Service, its rates, its operations, the work we've done on universal service and the monopoly, we have an important voice that Congress does look to and we provide input to, and hence my comments today is a call to arms, if you will, for our policymakers to build upon that work and deal with fundamental issues that actually are outside our wheelhouse. David.
You have several important studies coming up. Could you talk a little bit about what those are intended to be?
Oh, sure. Thank you, David. Yeah, the Postal Regulatory Commission in the coming year and a half, 2 years, has some very critical studies that are mandated by law. The first one that's on our plate is by the end of this year. The law requires at least every 5 years. We look at the 2006 law, which fundamentally was the first time our nation changed its postal laws in a comprehensive way, and the last time it did so, since 1970, when our postal service was created out of what was a cabinet agency. Every 5 years, we're supposed to assess the changes of that 2006 law and provide recommendations to the President and Congress how it's working and how it can be improved. We're starting that process now, and we'll issue that report. The second, and probably even more critical one, goes to the rate-setting system of our United States Postal Service. I talked about the financials earlier and referenced that there's a temporary surcharge in place that provides about $2 billion a year to the Postal Service and its bottom line. It was put in place to recoup the losses they incurred in the Great Recession, and under that law, that will be rescinded on April 10th of this year, but that has a bottom line impact. That's all part of a rate-setting system that, for the most of Postal Service's products, were put in place a price cap system in the 2006 law. But what the 2006 law also said was after 10 years of this price cap system, the regulator needs to look at how that system is operated and see if it's meeting the objectives of the law, and if it isn't, make such modifications or such alternative system to meet those objectives. As we know, the financials of the Postal Service are not good. One of the 9 objectives in law is the financial stability of the Postal Service, including a mandate that they have retained earnings. Needless to say, they do not. So we have the responsibility to undertake a full assessment. We're going to begin that as the law requires after 10 years, which would be December 20th. My desire and commitment to the postal community in the United States is that we do that as efficiently and effectively as possible. The last place I want to be is to be creating uncertainty for the mailing community. So I expect later this year, before the end of summer, we'll be outlining for the public what our plan is, and on December 20th, begin that study immediately, open it up for comment, focus on how those objectives are working, and hopefully over the course of 2017 be able to end up with a conclusion that provides more answers than questions. So those are 2 critical studies that are on our plate. There's a few more. We also, every 5 years, have to look at the contribution to the Postal Service's overhead from competitive products, what that percentage should be, because the idea is the letter products, the market-down products, can't be cross-subsidizing and subsidizing their competitive ventures. So we have to make sure that contribution is set appropriately. We'll be looking at that. And then in addition to all that, there's the normal overflowing docket of cases before us. You know, the Postal Regulatory Commission, it's, as I said, sometimes it's like David and Goliath. We are an agency of barely 70 people, and that includes the commissioners and their staff, regulating a $69 billion operation with 600,000 people. Now, again, we're the regulator, not the operator, and I'm not suggesting we should be anything in size and scope, but we do that with a budget that's pretty much been flatlined. Last year was the first year we got an appropriation that was at a level never seen before. So we're running hard. I worry about the staff at the commission. They do really hard work, great work, but one of my tasks as the current head of the agency is making sure not only are we working as efficiently and effectively in what we do, but that the staff have the resources they need and they feel good as public employees about the work they do each day. So it's a little bit of a longer answer to your question, David, but thank you.